In the forgotten hollows of eastern Kentucky, where pine trees loom like mute bodyguards and the air smells like mildew and regret, there used to be a place locals never mentioned by name. They just called it, that place. The rest of us came to know it as Ashwick. Ashwick Asylum for the morally defective child. A name that tells you everything and nothing. Really, between 1865 and 1897, more than 400 children were sent there. Most didn't come back out. Officially, Ashwick was a Christian rehabilitation home for troubled youth. Unofficially, it was a post-war horror show wrapped in prayer and patriotism, and one of the most efficient death machines the South ever disguised as charity. I only heard about it because of a dusty leather trunk I found in my grandfather's attic. Inside, letters sealed with wax, medical reports stamped by the church, and one photograph so water-stained and dark it looked more like an X-ray than a memory. The caption on the back just said, Room B, the Hymn Trials. Yeah, Hymn Trials. We'll get to that. But first, before we wade into this swamp of scripture, screams, and sanctified suffering, a warning. If you're here for comfort, tap out now. I won't hold it against you, but if you're the kind of person who thinks the past doesn't stay buried just because we stop talking about it, then welcome. You're right where you belong. Let's go back to 1865. The Civil War was over, the country was bleeding, and churches were handing out answers like candy laced with arsenic. That's when the Calderon family arrived in Kentucky and opened the gates of Ashwick. Gates that, for most kids, only open one way. Now, to understand what went wrong or what was designed to go wrong, you need to understand who built it. Reverend Silas Calderon was the ringleader. A battlefield chaplain turned self-declared child reformer. Picture a tall, skeletal man with sunken eyes and a voice that could switch from lullaby to damnation in a single breath. Locals said he spoke like the devil quoting scripture. Said he'd seen visions in the mud of Gettysburg, visions of a lost generation of sinful children, who could only be saved through discipline, obedience, and something he called purification fasting. Nice guy. His wife, Temperance Calderon, was rarely seen. People whispered she'd once been a patient in a Pennsylvania asylum. Others said she never spoke above a whisper after Ashwick opened. No one knows for sure. Her presence was more of a rumor than a person. But the Calderon children? Oh, they were unforgettable. Especially Elias Calderon, the eldest. In a letter dated 1873, he wrote, "We tried the new silence chambers today. Most lasted under an hour. One boy bit through his tongue. Father says that means the system is working." That's not a made-up quote. That's ink on paper, still smudged with what I hope was just old blood and mold. One of the earliest recorded incidents, and I'm using that word generously, happened in 1871. A boy named Jonah Bates was placed into what they called the mercy cell for failure to conform. He was 9. They found him 3 days later, knees bent backward, eyes wide open, mouthing hymns with no voice left. The official report said, "Spiritual breakthrough achieved." That phrase shows up a lot in the records. Spiritual breakthrough, which sounds a lot better than ritualized psychological torture in the name of holiness. But here we are. The chapel, which eventually became a laboratory, still stands. Or what's left of it. Locals won't go near it. They say if you get close enough, you can hear someone humming Rock of Ages beneath the floorboards. And if you listen longer, it starts humming back in your voice. So yeah, this is not just a story about one insane preacher. This is about a family dynasty, a religious cover, and a very profitable little machine that turned children into obedience or corpses. Drop a comment. Let us know where you're listening from. Because the shadows cast by Ashwick, they stretch farther than you think. People like to say monsters hide in the shadows. Ashwick proves that's optimistic. Some of them wore perfume. Some had perfect posture. Some played him so beautifully, you'd swear heaven was in the room, until you realized the crying wasn't part of the song. Josephine Calderon was 26 when Ashwick opened its doors. Local papers called her radiant and refined. She taught music at the parish, organized charity drives, and composed her own devotional hymns. A real angel. If angels locked children in candlelit rooms and played piano while they screamed. One survivor, a girl named Helena Wexley, described it like this in an unsent letter recovered from the archives. She told us our pain was the sound of the devil leaving. She smiled when we bled on the bench. She never blinked while she played. But Josephine wasn't alone. Then came Nathaniel and Mercy, twins age 21, and if there was ever a case for separating siblings at birth, this was it. Nathaniel ran the operations. Intake, room assignments, staff coordination. A kind of front desk Satan. Mercy, on the other hand, was posted in what they called the reflection wing, which sounds like a spa treatment but was really just cold, empty rooms with no beds, no food, and one rule: you come out quiet or not at all. They claimed it taught humility. Personally, I think it just saved on food costs. And then there was Dr. Albin Calderon, Silas's younger brother. A defrocked neurologist from Baltimore with a fondness for scalpels and theories best left in the 18th century. He specialized in obedience mapping, which, translated from Victorian nonsense, means, I poke your brain until you stop talking. He invented something called the silent chamber. Supposedly, it was soundproof. Survivors said it wasn't. They said the walls shook. There's a log dated July 6, 1874, where Dr. Albin wrote, the boy resisted the sleep saline, so the twins restrained him. For hours later, the humming stopped. Resistance levels reduced by 73%. That boy was Thomas Ellery, age 11. He had tried to run. After his session, he never tried again. He also never walked again. Now, you might be asking, how did a family like this operate in plain sight for over 30 years? Simple: God, flags, and funding. Silas Calderon was appointed honorary chaplain of the Kentucky Orphan Relief Fund. Josephine published religious poetry in regional newsletters. Elias Calderon, remember him from earlier, donated to medical drives and publicly lobbied for reform-centered child recovery programs. Mercy once gave a speech at a church benefit titled, Obedience is Love. So yes, on paper, Ashwick was a beacon of charity. A second chance for the morally broken. But inside, there were no second chances, just files. And those files, unsealed in 1972, told stories even seasoned FBI archivists reportedly couldn't finish reading aloud. We'll get to those records soon. But first, the building. Because Ashwick wasn't just a hospital. It was a machine. Every hallway, every doorway, every echo was calculated. You ever walk into a place that feels off? Not haunted, exactly. Just wrong. Like the walls were built for something other than people? That's how survivors described the chapel. It was the first structure built, even before the dormitories or kitchens. Made from gray stone imported from Virginia. Cold to the touch. Damp in summer. Crumbling in winter. The stained glass windows shimmered with saints and angels. Yes. But the central panel showed a sword-wielding archangel towering over a weeping child. Symbolism? Not exactly subtle. The pews could seat 120. But according to staff records, they rarely used more than 10. That's because public worship wasn't the point. Worship was performed. What they really wanted was obedience. And the acoustics? Too perfect. You could hear a pin drop from the altar to the rear wall. Which means you could also hear crying. Or begging. Or bones against wood. Every sound echoed. Nothing escaped. That's by design. Ashwick wasn't just built to house children. It was built to break them. In 1994, a box of old blueprints resurfaced in a forgotten corner of the Kentucky State Archive. No digital record. No property stamp. Just brittle parchment rolled inside a rusted pipe. And what it revealed wasn't in any of the Ashwick inspection reports, charity pamphlets, or so-called chapel renovation logs. Turns out Ashwick had a basement. Not the kind with dusty tools and expired cans of beans. No, this was 12 stone-walled rooms with no windows, no exits, and no paperwork. Each cell came pre-furnished with iron shackles, narrow trench drains, and a vent system that could deliver, and I quote, variable controlled temperature and chemical exposure. Because that's what every children's charity facility needs, right? Adjustable atmospheric torture options. At the far end of this underground maze sat something labeled Observation Chamber B. a single room directly connected to Dr. Albin Calderon's private lab by a narrow tunnel. Just in case you thought the whole obedience mapping thing wasn't literal. And yes, if this sounds eerily familiar, it should. We've seen this kind of setup before: Ravensbrück, Tuskegee, Willowbrook. The only difference is, this happened decades earlier and it happened to children. Now, if you're wondering how anyone got away with this, congratulations, you still believe in public oversight. See, the church visitors, the donors, the bishops, they got the Sunday morning version of Ashwick. Clean beds, braided hair, a warm sermon from Reverend Silas, Josephine smiling at the piano, the children humming along. They didn't see the trapdoor hidden beneath the chapel altar. The velvet curtain dais? Yeah, it lifted up. Underneath was a cold, narrow stairwell that led to a place the Calderons called the penumbra, Latin for the edge of shadow. Sounds poetic until you realize they meant it literally. Only one person ever tried to speak up. His name was Ellis Rowe, a young coal worker who delivered fuel to the chapel furnaces. One day in 1873, he claimed to hear children crying beneath the floorboards. He told the sheriff. A week later, Ellis was found face down in Mill Pond Lake, mouth filled with gravel. The coroner called it a tragic worksite accident. Of course he did. After that, silence. 18 years of it. But the architecture tells its own story. The way the chapel's acoustics were designed, curved ceilings, staggered pews, deep stone, made sure every acceptable sound echoed like a sermon, and every unacceptable one stayed buried. The children were taught from day one that the basement wasn't real, just a myth to keep them in line. But the screams, they were very real. And if you want to understand how the Calderons justified it, not just how they acted but how they rationalized it, you have to read the book they never published. Not the Bible Silas waved around in public. I'm talking about a hand-bound volume found behind Elias's surgical desk after the 1906 fire. The spine was charred. The pages smelled like smoke and vinegar. But the title was still legible. The Doctrine of Broken Things. Charming. According to a 1978 fire inspector's report, portions of the text survived. What it revealed wasn't just disturbing, it was calculated. The Calderons believed some children were unsold. Not evil. Not possessed. Just born wrong. Mixed blood. Illegitimacy. Signs of trauma. Disabilities. Anything outside their twisted blueprint of God's design. Silas wrote that such children lacked spiritual architecture, and therefore couldn't be saved by normal grace. The only path to salvation was what he called calibrated suffering. Yeah. They didn't torture children despite their faith. They did it because of it. One passage reads, "The vessel must be shattered before it can be sanctified. The cries of the weak are not pain, but purification." Another, "A child's silence is not a sign of trauma, but the beginning of correction. He who screams is resisting. He who submits becomes clay." They called it reform through collapse. And that's not hyperbole. That's literally what's written in the margin next to a list of candidate ages and trial durations. So next time someone tries to tell you Ashwick was just a product of its time, remember this: there was nothing accidental about the suffering. It was engineered. And the blueprints prove it. Let's talk about grace, the Calderon definition, not the comforting church kind. Their version involved isolation, hunger, exposure to near-freezing temperatures, followed by something they called structured guidance. What was that exactly? Restraints, sensory deprivation, forced hallucinations, and a gentle voice reminding you, this is the path to God. Sound familiar? Modern psychology calls it trauma bonding. Cults call it breakthrough. The Calderons? They called it grace. Because of course they did. By the early 1870s, Ashwick had evolved into a full-blown conversion factory. Children arrived by train or wagon, usually from overburdened orphanages or families with secrets that were easier to ship away than explain. The paperwork always used the same euphemism: involuntary placement for moral realignment. Translation: this one cries too much, stutters, or saw something they shouldn't have. Each new child was evaluated by Josephine and Elias within 48 hours. If they were obedient, they were sent to the communal dorms, which, mind you, still weren't great. If they resisted, hesitated, or flinched, they were labeled Category 3. And Category 3 meant one thing: you're going below. If they ran, they were classified as non-viables. What happened to non-viables? Well, they were never reassigned. They were just gone. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Surely someone noticed. A nurse, a teacher, a priest? Anyone? They did. They just didn't last long. In 1875, Margaret Bellamy, a visiting nurse from the Kentucky Board of Mental Health, wrote a letter expressing concern over the unregistered basement level, the decomposing scent in the corridor, and what she politely referred to as disturbing irregularities in child affect. She mailed the letter. 3 weeks later, she was diagnosed with melancholic hysteria and committed to St. Jude's Sanatorium in Louisville. She died there 8 months later from self-starvation. Her complaint was never investigated. Her name was quietly removed from the staff list. So I'll ask you again, and this won't be the last time. How many people knew and looked away? How many were convinced that this wasn't cruelty? It was just a necessary correction. Because once you start believing some kids are born broken, almost anything becomes permissible. Especially behind chapel walls. Let's talk numbers. Or rather, the disturbing lack of them. From 1865 to 1897, Ashwick officially reported 223 children admitted. But in 1968, state auditors found supply orders, medical shipments, and transportation vouchers for over 600. That's a shortfall of nearly 400 children. Children who, on paper, never existed. It gets worse. A cross-reference in the 1990s, comparing Ashwick's patient logs with train depot records from Hazard, Kentucky, showed at least 142 children arrived, but were never entered into the system. No bed assigned. No meal rations issued. No names recorded. They vanished. Some argued it could have been typhoid, flu outbreaks, maybe clerical error. But then in 1995, an independent researcher named Dr. Helen Marston gained access to a forgotten trunk of personal correspondence. Letters written by Reverend Silas Calderon to orphanage directors, distant relatives, even minor clergy. Dozens of letters. Dozens of handwritten death notices. Each one using the same chilling template. We regret to inform you that the child in question passed peacefully in the night, having completed his time of refinement. Please find enclosed a devotional card and the child's baptismal record. Signed. Signed by who? Josephine Calderon. There was one letter in particular, dated September 3, 1881, addressed to a Father Albrecht in Charleston. It read, "The boy could not be corrected. His resistance exceeded our predictions. Dr. Albin advised final sanctification. He did not suffer. He returned to the Lord clean." That boy's name was Samuel Farley. He was 8. He had a stutter and refused to kneel during prayer. His body was never found. But his name appeared again, in a visitor's log from 1882, under the heading, "Subject used in empathy conditioning." The handwriting was Elias Calderon's. And just like that, Samuel became part of the system. Now, let me ask you something. If your child vanished, no grave, no casket, no explanation, but you got a sympathy card with a quote from Isaiah 1 verse 25, would you believe it was natural? The families did, because they were told their children weren't just gone. They were redeemed, sanctified by suffering, purified through collapse. And so the machinery turned year after year, not because no one knew, but because enough people believed it was holy. It is with divine sorrow that we inform you of the child's passing during corrective rites. The body has been sanctified and returned to the earth. We pray your heart finds peace in their restoration. That was the template. No date, no location, no medical cause of death. Just a soft little devotional card tucked inside a wooden box with a name scrawled in pencil. Oh, and one keepsake. A child's shoe. A torn Bible page. A hair ribbon stiff with blood. Once even a finger bone, wrapped in paper like a party favor from hell. I found one of those boxes myself. It was buried beneath my grandmother's porch, inside an old flour sack tied with a rosary. Her older sister had been placed in Ashwick in 1884. Never came back. My grandmother never talked about it. Just said, she was too loud for the Lord. The box had her sister's name inside, and half of a communion wafer, burnt at the edge. Now think about this. You're the last living relative of a child. No body, no grave, no answers, just a splintered keepsake wrapped in scripture. And you're expected to smile, nod, and move on. Because if you questioned the Calderons, you weren't just challenging a family. You were challenging God. And in 19th century Kentucky, that was career suicide. Or just suicide. But here's what really gnaws at me. It wasn't random. The children most likely to vanish weren't just poor. They were black, mixed race, disabled, or born out of wedlock. The kids' society had already quietly labeled disposable. The Calderons didn't need to erase them. Society already had. And that ease is what makes Ashwick so horrifying. Not just the cruelty, but how effortlessly the world let it happen. To this day, no confirmed burial ground has ever been located. No cemetery records. No obituaries. Just anomalies in the soil scans behind the chapel. 17 depressions unevenly spaced, for feet long, exactly the size of a small coffin. If anyone had bothered to use coffins. And beneath those, charred beams, stacked, interlocked, what investigators now believe was a burn chamber, a furnace for the ones labeled non-viable. We'll get back to that. But first, you need to understand how Ashwick scaled up. Because by the late 1870s, this wasn't just a family-run asylum. This was franchise horror. Enter the Society for Moral Architecture. Sounds like a cult. Worse, it was a network, made up of clergy, judges, physicians, and industrialists. Men who believed the South wasn't just rebuilding, it was rotting from within. And who better to fix that than a private club of upper-class zealots with a few extra barns and no ethics? Their mission? Restore the Christian order through the institutional correction of defective stock. Yes, they really called children that. Defective stock. No records of the society appear in official archives. But in 1986, a retired priest passed away in Louisiana. In his attic, they found letters dozens between him and Reverend Silas Calderon. They discussed meeting locations, funding channels, selection criteria. They even had templates, like one letter dated 1879. Subject is of diminished soul-bearing. While compliant under him exposure, he fails to show reverent response under purification rites. Recommend reassignment to Tier 5. Tier 5, by the way, meant one thing: no retention pathway, which is code for dispose quietly. And yes, these letters had footnotes, like a Bible study. Only instead of interpreting grace, they were debating whether a mute child could be taught reverence through nerve severance. Let that sink in. This wasn't just a handful of sadists in a stone building. This was organized suffering. Funded, protected, believed in. Because once you build a system where pain equals purification, and obedience equals love, you can pretty much do whatever you want, as long as you call it grace. Children beyond spiritual recall are best returned to the source. Their pain sanctifies our own failings as stewards of virtue. Dr. Malcolm Hale, 1879. Professor of Phrenology, Boston. Never visited Ashwick once. And yet, this man, this ivory tower pseudoscientist who wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes in Thornhill's crawlspaces, donated over $5,000 worth of surgical equipment. Adjusted for inflation? About $150,000. All sent to a building where children weren't healed. They were measured, observed, and refined. Because by the late 1870s, the Society for Moral Architecture wasn't operating on faith anymore. They were operating on metrics, survival rates, silencing response times, resistance breakdown periods, and the darkest of all, moral erasure success scores. In one file, dated October 1881, Case 42C, female mulatto, age 9. Collapse achieved in 72 hours. Viable for replication. I mean, say what you want about religion, but at least most churches don't use a B testing on torture. This wasn't theology. This was systematized cruelty. branded holy, spreadsheet like a grant proposal and funded like a startup. You ask, why didn't anyone stop it? Because powerful men thought they were doing something sacred. They didn't see themselves as abusers. They saw themselves as engineers of the soul, recalibrating a broken post-war world. And in that worldview, pain was just a means to order. Now let's fast forward to winter, 1880. The chapel underwent renovations, but not to expand seating for worship, not to improve heating for the dorms. No, they installed listening tunnels and underground access shafts. One tunnel led to a nearby textile workshop, the Stitch Hall, staffed entirely by children. The average workday began at 3 a.m., ended at dusk. If you dropped a needle, missed a count, fell asleep, you were reassigned to Chamber B. There's no record of any adult staff, except one name handwritten in 3 separate logbooks. Mercy Calderon. We'll come back to her. Trust me, she deserves her own chapter. But before that, I want to tell you about Delilah M. Because in this ocean of ash and absence, she left something behind. Delilah was 8. She arrived in autumn 1881, daughter of a washerwoman and a black Union soldier. Her mother died giving birth. Her father was never found. She was labeled Category 3 because she laughed when shown scripture. She was sent below within 48 hours. And yet, somehow, Delilah remembered who she was. She found a hymnal in the North Dorm, broken spine, missing half its pages. She carved out space between hymn number 141 and number 142. And inside she started writing. 12 pages, scrawled in pencil, folded into the warped leather cover. And they stayed hidden for 123 years. Until 2004, during a private demolition on the Ashwick grounds, a historian named Maeve Kennerly found the hymnal buried beneath a floorboard. Water damaged, warped with time, smelled like mildew, dust and something metallic. Inside, Delilah's voice, faint, fragmented but clear. Here are a few of her entries. They said God lives under the stairs. The soup has rocks again. Miss Mercy said if I can't stop looking scared, I'll have to wear the sack. Brother Elias smells like burnt sugar and always smiles too much. A girl named Anna screamed until her teeth fell out. The walls know when you cry. They're not full sentences. They're trauma snapshots. But together, they paint a map of suffering more precise than any file or blueprint. Delilah wrote like someone trying to prove she existed. And you know what? She did. Because when the Ashwick Chapel finally burned, when the society dissolved and the Calderons scattered like roaches in sunlight, Delilah was still on record. Her name, her number, her laugh, that made her dangerous. Because memory is rebellion. And she somehow survived just long enough to leave one behind. You ever read something that felt like it knew you were going to find it? Delilah M. didn't leave a diary. She left a distress beacon, scrawled in pencil between the hymns of a moldy church book buried under floorboards. Here's what she wrote. Today the soup had something in it. I didn't tell. She made Ruth sing with no tongue. He said the cold makes you clean. I'm tired of clean. There's a room under the church. It eats the loud ones. I counted 4 windows. Then none. I wish my name wasn't mine. Those aren't notes. They're coordinates in hell. Delilah's last line? If you find this, I'm probably not. But Ruth saw the door open. That means somebody hears. I hope it's God or a woman. That hit me like a gut punch. Not because of the God part. Let's be honest, God took an extended sabbatical from Thornhill. But because she pinned her hope to the one thing even older than prayer. A woman who sees through the lie. Delilah didn't need rescue. She needed a witness. And here's the thing, one might have come. You've probably heard the legend, even if you didn't know her name. They called her the woman in white. Some said she was a ghost. A pale figure in the corridor, just past midnight. She didn't speak, didn't scream, but bandages appeared by your cot after punishment. Water cups, tiny kindnesses in a place built to erase people. Turns out she wasn't a ghost. Her name was Eleanor Witt, and she was very real. Born in 1850, daughter of a field physician and a black midwife. Widowed by 24, childless, and scandal of scandals, she refused to remarry, which in Victorian Kentucky basically made her a witch. She spent the war working in underground clinics, the kind that treated runaway children, unwed mothers, and smallpox patients with no names. She wasn't licensed because heaven forbid women have medical authority. But she knew enough to sew a wound, stop a fever, and lie with a straight face when it counted. In the spring of 1882, just months after Delilah vanished, Eleanor applied for a job at Thornhill. Not as a nurse, not as a teacher, but as a laundress. She scrubbed blood from smocks and hymns from bed sheets. But that wasn't why she was there. You see, Eleanor had heard the stories, whispers from children who escaped, dreams that smelled like scorched linen and rot. She knew Thornhill wasn't a hospital. It was a stage, and she came to watch. A letter recovered from Eleanor's trunk after her death reads, "There are things I cannot fix here, but I can remember them. I can write them. If no one listens now, someone will later. I do not need to win. I need the truth to rot slower than their lies." And that's exactly what she did. She started smuggling out records, slips of chalkboard tallies, discarded intake forms, even a sketch of the surgical lamp requisitioned the week after Delilah's final journal page. That requisition, it included a child-sized, straight-back chair. Coincidence? Not likely. We don't know exactly what happened to Delilah. There's no burial, no discharge, no name carved in stone. But we know the system tried to erase her. And Eleanor? She refused to let that happen. She kept Delilah's journal, hid it in a hymnal, buried it beneath a loose board in the dormitory floor, knowing she might never see it again, knowing maybe, just maybe, one day someone would read it and say her name out loud. Let's talk about what that does to a place, to memory, because every horror has its haunt, but Thornhill had something worse, a memory that fought back. You think ghosts are terrifying? Try a child's last thoughts, smuggled through hymns and rot and time, still whispering, still waiting. That's why we dig. That's why we tell these stories. Not for closure, not for curiosity, but because memory is rebellion. And sometimes the only holy thing left in a place like Thornhill is the woman who writes it down. You ever hear the phrase, quiet resistance? Not the movie kind, no dynamite, no speeches, no last-minute rescues. I'm talking about needlepoint espionage, chalk-written names smuggled inside laundry carts, and one woman who stitched horror into cotton thread so anyone, might someday read it. Her name was Eleanor Witt, and for 3 years, she played the long game at Ashwick Asylum. She never yelled, never pulled a child out of a cell mid-punishment. She just watched, listened, and kept receipts, meticulously, literally. Receipts with initials, dates, sometimes what organ had malfunctioned. And her hiding places? Let's just say she made every inch of her laundress quarters a silent archive. Inside a satchel, wedged between the stone wall and the east furnace, investigators found 22 names, children not listed in any official register. A broken locket with the initials RD carved into the back, Ruth D., the girl who once sang with no tongue, and a tiny glass bottle, tagged in Eleanor's handwriting, Mercy's Draft, Test 4C. Now, Mercy's Draft might sound like a 19th century herbal cough syrup, but what it really was, a chemical obedience serum. Testimony from the 1902 grand jury would later confirm the formula. Opium tincture plus mercuric chloride, a heavy metal poison that doesn't just damage your kidneys, it turns your brain into a haunted attic of hallucinations, apathy, and eventually total silence. Mercy Calderon wasn't just dosing children. She was experimenting, tracking how long it took a child to stop resisting or stop breathing. And Eleanor? She had the proof. But every time she got close to exposing something, the target vanished. Literally. Children reassigned. Rooms emptied. Names scrubbed from the logs like they never existed. It's like the building itself learned how to erase. But then, Eleanor tried something different. Late 1885, She smuggled 2 children out during a delivery transfer, tucked into laundry crates, beneath wet sheets and sulfur-soaked linens. One didn't make it. Exposure 6 miles out. Frostbite. Heart gave out. But the other, Ansel, 8 years old, stuttered when afraid. Always looked down. He made it. He made it all the way to a Unitarian mission house in Jackson County. And 40 years later, in 1921, that same boy, now a man, finally spoke during a federal hearing. He said, "She was the first person who ever looked at me like I was a person, not a sin. And I gotta be honest with you, I've read hundreds of testimonies while researching Ashwick. That one, that's the one that gutted me, because it wasn't a cry for help. It was proof that help had tried." Now here's where things go quiet. Permanently. Eleanor was reported missing in January of 1886. Official story? She wandered into the woods during a snowstorm and never came back. Right? Because nothing says suspicious timing like a blizzard disappearance 2 weeks after you expose a sedative experiment on children. Oh, and her punch card? Still stamped 2 days after her supposed disappearance. Because if Thornhill was good at anything, it was rewriting timelines. The last known entry in her hidden satchel, dated December 18, 1885, simply reads, "Draft 4C confirmed. Silence in under 10 minutes. Ansel responsive after second wash. Ruth not seen since Thursday. Linen count matches none. I fear they know." Then nothing. The furnace near her quarters was rebuilt in 1886. No body was found. But then again, in Ashwick's version of truth, no body usually means burned, buried, or bureaucratically erased. And here's the part that still haunts me. She knew she wouldn't survive. She stitched truth into pillow seams, hid names in soap boxes, left herself breadcrumbs, knowing someday someone might finally care enough to follow them. Eleanor didn't escape. She didn't blow the whistle. She didn't end the abuse. But she did something arguably braver. She remembered. When remembering was forbidden. When remembering could get you vanished. She made damn sure someone someday would know what was done at Ashwick. We tell horror stories like this not just to shiver. We tell them because sometimes the only justice left is witness. And Eleanor Witt? She was the quiet witness who made it impossible to forget. If I'm ever taken, may someone remember these names. They are real. They were here. God is not in this place. But I was. That's the last thing Eleanor Witt ever wrote. Not in a journal. Not in ink. She stitched it into the hem of a child's bedsheet, in red thread, and left it folded beneath the floorboards of the East Wing. They never found her body. But in 2008, during a floor replacement on what was once Ward B, workers pulled up a warped plank near the east furnace and found a bundle of linen soaked through with something brownish, sticky, and very, very old. Folded inside? One word, stitched in red, Delilah. Not a ghost story, a receipt. And that's the thing people keep misunderstanding about Eleanor. She wasn't some wailing spirit doomed to haunt hallways and flicker lights. She was worse. She was a witness. A living, breathing witness to an institution that looked at human suffering and called it salvation. And for that, she was erased. But let's talk about the room. Because there's always a room, isn't there? Every horror story has one. The one nobody builds, nobody labels, nobody wants to admit existed. At Thornhill they called it unofficially the Dead Wing. And what made it special? Well, it didn't exist. Not on any of the blueprints. Not on the original 1865 build plans. Not the 1874 fire code revision. Not even Eleanor's sketches. And she was the kind of woman who noted the squeak in the west stairwell. But it was there. Sealed. Not with a door. With 2 feet of poured concrete. Smoothed over and painted to match the surrounding brick. Out of sight. Out of memory. Until it wasn't. July 3, 1997. A historical restoration crew was prepping Thornhill for its big rebrand, a heritage learning center. Because nothing says field trip fun like the sight of a generational trauma pit. Anyway, one of the crew, a guy named Tomas Ramirez, was taking a sledgehammer to the north hallway's internal support wall. When he hit something that sounded off, hollow, the entire project stopped. They brought in surveyors. They drilled. And behind the wall, under that concrete, a room. And not just a room. A sealed crypt, 15 feet long, 10 feet wide, 8 feet high. No windows. No ventilation. Just a ceiling hatch, iron bars welded shut. On paper, it never existed. But in reality, it had teeth. The air inside? Unbreathable. They had to wear full hazmat gear. Samples revealed phenol, chloroform, and mercuric vapor, all chemicals commonly used in 19th century sedation experiments. Mercy's draft. Anyone? The walls were covered in scratches. Some down near the floorboards, some higher up, where children tried standing to claw their way out. Black scorch marks around the baseboards. A rusted metal bucket in one corner. And in the other, 17 pairs of small shoes, each tied together with fabric strips. Careful, ritualistic, like someone wanted to catalog the lives that were lost there without ever acknowledging them. No bones, no bodies, just absence. At the center of the room, a child-sized chair, bolted to the floor. Leather restraints still intact. The kind of chair designed not for comfort, not even for containment, but for observation, for measurement. And on the far wall, a message, barely visible, etched with fingers, or maybe nails. Through decades of grime and soot, investigators found a short line scratched into the brick. I was awake the whole time. Let that sit for a second. The chair, the chemicals, the burn marks, the silence. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't someone snapping. This was a designed outcome. And you know what really gets me? There were no medical records, no punishment logs, no scribbled ledger of what went on in that room. Because some rooms were built not to rehabilitate but to disappear you. Now here's the cherry on the rotten cake. That entire wing was scheduled to be turned into an interactive exhibit for schoolchildren. History you can walk through, the brochure said. Guess they figured nobody would notice the concrete wall that sweated in winter or the shoes no one could explain. I've been to Thornhill. I've stood in that hallway. And let me tell you, even now it's colder by a full 6 degrees in that spot. Smells like bleach, wet stone, and something you don't have a name for. Something old and metallic that clings to the back of your throat like regret. They tried sealing it back up. They tried calling it an unrecorded subchamber. But if you press your hand to the bricks, just under where the hatch once was, you can still feel a faint indentation, from where someone kicked the wall, over, and over, and over. We don't tell these stories to scare people, okay, maybe a little, but mostly we tell them because memory matters. And Thornhill, like too many places, was a machine built to grind children into silence. People like Eleanor Witt, they didn't destroy the machine, but they made sure it couldn't disappear without a trace. Because somewhere under the concrete, someone was awake. Stop awake. Please don't go. That's what they found scratched into the wall. Not a full sentence. Not even a proper plea. Just a leftover fragment of someone trying not to vanish. And then there was one word, repeated again and again. Ruth. That name again. Ruth. Same girl Delilah M. mentioned in her journal. Same child Eleanor Witt tried to protect. Same name embroidered in a broken locket found behind the east furnace. This wasn't coincidence. It was a trail. A blood-soaked breadcrumb trail leading back to a room that shouldn't have existed. The room wasn't labeled. Not officially. No door number. No map reference. But in 2009, a retired archivist dumped a box of misfiled Thornhill memos onto a university desk in Lexington. And tucked in with all the old heating invoices and dried-out ink pens was a memo, typed, stamped, dated March 5, 1891. Sissy 1B to remain sealed. Reassign resistant inventory. Reintegration unlikely. Protocol remains silence. Sissy 1B. Correction Cell 1B. That room. You ever wonder what it takes for an institution like Thornhill to go, you know what? This one's a little too evil. Let's seal it in concrete? Because that's what they did. Correction Cell 1B was designed for children who couldn't be reformed by the usual techniques. Hunger, isolation, prayer, heavy sedation, the Ashwick greatest hits. This room? It wasn't about punishment. It was about erasure. Silence as a tool. Time as a weapon. And the kind of quiet that scratches through brick. But here's the part that never stops messing with my head. During the final day of excavation in 1997, one of the workers, Tomas Ramirez again, had his recorder running when they heard it, tapping. Not loud, not rhythmic, just there, steady, coming from the far wall of the crypt. They stopped, checked for animals, checked the pipes. Nothing. The sound stopped the moment the cameras came on. Of course it did, because ghosts or whatever they were don't perform on cue. 2 days later, a piece of plaster fell from the opposite wall. Behind it, a sealed compartment. Inside, folded like an offering. A child's drawing, charcoal on linen. 6 stick figures in a row. 5 were smiling. The 6th? No face, and barely visible, in red ink along the cloth's edge. Delilah. Same girl. Same silence. Same thread through it all. By the late 1890s, Thornhill had a problem. Too many missing kids. Too many stories leaking through floorboards. Too many names surfacing in places they shouldn't. And the Calderons? They weren't just losing control. They were becoming a liability. But in the end, the thing that finally broke Thornhill wasn't justice, wasn't exposure, wasn't even Eleanor Witt. It was a flood. Spring, 1897. Lickstone River breached its banks during a week-long storm. Water poured into the asylum's underground levels, bursting pipes and collapsing corridors like God's plumbing finally rebelled. And what surfaced? Not mud, not even silt. Bones. Tiny jawbones. Bits of spine. Rusted floor restraints still bolted to panels. Even a few twisted wire mouth gags, the kind used to suppress speech. Locals found fragments of child-sized crutches, too waterlogged to stand upright, warped from rot. One farmer, name redacted in the official report but preserved in local legend, said he saw a sheet of soaked-in pages floating downriver like scripture trying to flee the scene. And if you're wondering, no, there was no investigation. The site was closed off for 3 days, then reopened. No headlines, no inquiry, just a fire 2 weeks later that just so happened to consume the chapel and most of the West Wing dormitory records. Official cause? Lightning strike. Unofficially? Locals, including a night watchman whose diary I found in my uncle's basement, saw men unloading crates from the building around midnight. Stenciled on the wood in black paint. SMA. Society for Moral Architecture. Because apparently, when your Frankenstein monster starts bleeding into the basement, the first thing you do is pack up the notes and burn the lab. And here's one more thing. Something Eleanor once wrote, stitched under the lining of a cot mattress in Wing D. They don't bury the children here. They bury the records. She wasn't wrong. In Thornhill, paper burned faster than bodies ever could. And silence? It wasn't a symptom. It was the system. You know how people always say, well, if it was really that bad, why didn't someone shut it down? Well, someone did. But not for the reasons you'd hope. Within 2 months of Eleanor Witt's disappearance, Reverend Silas Calderon, the smiling shepherd of suffering, announced his retirement. Official reason. Spiritual fatigue. Translation. He finally realized building your legacy on child-sized restraints and mercury-laced sedation has a burnout rate. Mercy Calderon? She just disappeared. No death certificate, no forwarding address. She walked out of history like someone who knew the fire was coming. And Josephine Calderon? Tucked away in a long-term restorative facility, which is 19th century Southern Christian for, let's not let her talk to anyone ever again. By autumn, Thornhill was shuttered, publicly due to budgetary constraints, privately, because the building had started coughing up secrets. And just like that, the land was sold to a coal syndicate. The structure left to rot. No memorial, no plaque, just 70 years of silence. Thick, intentional, sealed with an odd silence. But the cover-up? Oh, it didn't stop with paperwork. In 1902, a local schoolteacher, name redacted, but referenced in a hospital registry as HL, began asking questions, started snooping around the ruins, talking to old staff. 6 weeks later, she was committed for obsessive delusions. And in 1924, a journalist named Henry Dunlop published an article titled, "The Orphan House the Devil Built." It ran in the Lexington Evening Standard. Good paper. Was the paper folded within the year, and Dunlop vanished on a research trip to Hazard County. Never returned. Never found. Just a pair of his boots discovered 6 months later in the woods, toes facing opposite directions. Now you might be wondering, why go to such extremes to suppress a defunct asylum? Because Thornhill wasn't a scandal. It was a blueprint. What happened inside its brick and mildew-stained walls wasn't just allowed. It was studied, refined, and replicated in quiet corners of the country. Poorhouses, reform schools, church-run orphanages, places where the forgotten were handed over, and the doctrine of correction wore a human face. To expose Thornhill meant pulling the thread on every institution built on the same idea, that suffering cleanses, and silence means success. But despite all the fires, all the redacted names, all the God-stamped gaslighting, they missed something. They missed Delilah's name, stitched in red. They missed Eleanor's satchel, wedged behind a furnace. And they missed you, the people still listening. Because here's the thing about buried truth. It always rises. And in 1976, it started to speak again. Her name was Alexis Brandt. A young social worker, fresh out of grad school, probably still thought she could save the world with a clipboard and a tape recorder. She was gathering oral histories for the University of Kentucky, traveling through the Appalachian foothills, collecting stories from elders who'd outlived everyone who ever silenced them. She wasn't looking for Thornhill. She found it anyway. In a care home outside Berea, she sat down with a 90-year-old woman named Marion H. When Alexis asked about her childhood, Marion went silent. Then she whispered, "There was a place with no windows and a lady who never blinked." Alexis pressed gently. What Marion gave her wasn't a story. It was a song. No rhythm, no melody, just a slow, droning lullaby in a voice like dried leaves being crushed. Be still, or the angel will cry. Don't speak, or the silence will die. No mother, no father, no morning, no light. Just God in the hallway turning out the night. I'll give you a moment with that, because that exact verse was found scratched into the walls of Chamber B. So Marion remembered, even when her body forgot, even when time tried to rinse her mind clean. Over the next 18 months, Alexis would find 4 more survivors. They didn't call it Thornhill. They called it the Hill, or sometimes the Gray House. Every one of them had light sensitivity, wrist scars identical pale white like rope burns, and almost no memory before age 10. But when Alexis showed them a photo of Thornhill's chapel, they cried. Every single one. One of them, Benny K., said he remembered being locked in a cold box with red lights. He drew pictures of an iron chair with belts, described a girl named Lila who used to sing to him through the wall. He said her voice was the only thing that stopped him from biting his own hands. Another survivor, Thomasina, had become a nun later in life. She whispered to Alexis, "We weren't those children. We were practice." That line still gives me chills. Because what do you do with that? How do you process that some of the most vulnerable children in history were treated like test subjects in a theology lab? No justice, no trial, just the occasional whisper and a charred ledger in someone's attic. We like to believe horror dies with the building, but it doesn't. It lingers, in the soil, in the silence, in the lullabies no child should know. So if you ever find yourself near the old Thornhill property, now privately owned, fenced off, and just far enough out of town that no one hears the screaming goats at night, just remember, they burned the records, they buried the bodies, but they couldn't erase the witnesses. Not the little girl with the red-stitched name, not the nurse who folded horror into hospital linens, not the boy who remembered Lila singing through the wall, and not the woman in a nursing home singing into the silence. Because some memories rot, but some are too haunted to forget. Some stories don't end. They just stop being told out loud. The survivors of Thornhill? They never got apologies. Never got listed in any register. Never saw their names printed in a hearing transcript or carved into a memorial. But their scars told the same story as the architecture, the chemical inventory, the medical logs that somehow survived 3 accidental fires. And that's the thing. The body remembers. Even when the paper trail goes up in smoke, even when the institutions pretend you never existed. A limp, a tremor, a lullaby no child should know. They remain. I've seen it myself. One of the first times I ever heard of Thornhill was when I found a shoebox in my uncle's basement, tucked behind a stack of vinyls and tax returns. Inside were 6 Polaroids, all black and white, all taken in the late 70s, of elderly folks sitting in plastic chairs in front of a nursing home Christmas tree. On the back of one, written in faint blue ink, "This is Ruth, I think. She still hums." That's when I started digging. And that's how I found Alexis Brandt. Alexis compiled her interviews into a private archive. She begged editors, called newsrooms, knocked on doors. Nobody wanted it. Too dark. Too unverifiable. Or, my personal favorite, there's no appetite for trauma narratives right now. Cool. But Alexis left something in her field notes. Something that clings to me more than any photo or report. They didn't just silence children. They taught them to forget. But memory is a kind of ghost, too. And ghosts don't stay quiet forever. Let that one settle. Because memory isn't fragile. It's not polite. It waits. Festers. And then it howls. In 2022, during a structural stabilization project at the East Wing, now just a crumbling husk wrapped in barbed wire and bureaucracy, contractors found a false support column. Behind it, a hollow space. And inside that space, a rusted metal box. One of those hinged military types you see in war museums. Inside, a snapped fountain pen, a locket with 2 children's teeth, and a bundle of pages, scorched at the edges, warped by time, and written in a hand so tight and small, it looked like the letters were trying to hide. It was Eleanor's journal. Not the hospital notes. Not the receipts. Not the coded stitchwork in linens. This was personal. Raw. Exhausted. Undeniably human. Here are just a few entries. October 19, 1885. Ruth has stopped speaking. Not from silence, from absence. I touch her shoulder and she blinks like I'm not real. They call it mercy. I call it subtraction. November 2nd, 1885. I saw Josephine kneel beside Delilah's cot and whisper, "It's almost over." I do not believe she meant the night. November 27th, 1885. They tested a new serum yesterday. One child vomited black and didn't stop. I washed it away with my hands. I don't know her name. I don't know my own anymore. Let me pause on that one because that child, her intake file was found years later, labeled only T.44, listed as nonverbal, 3 feet tall, malnourished, admitted under moral deficiency. Her discharge status? No further action necessary. Yeah. Let's call that what it was. Disposal. The final page of Eleanor's journal, December 18th, 1885, is burned on the lower left. But what remains is crystal clear. If anyone finds this, please believe what the children say. They have no power, no voice, no weight in the world. But they carry the truth on their skin and in their eyes. They are not defective. They are not broken. They were made into silence piece by piece. And silence is the easiest lie to believe. Do not believe it. My name was Eleanor Witt. I was here. They were here. Please remember us. She didn't beg for rescue. She didn't call for vengeance. She just wanted to be remembered. And if you're still listening to this, if your stomach's turning and you're wondering what the hell kind of world let this happen, good. That means Eleanor was right. That someone's still listening. That memory didn't die with the children. Because it never does. So if you hear someone humming that strange lullaby, if you meet an elder who flinches at church bells, if you see a scar that's too small for an accident and too deliberate to be chance, listen. Don't explain it away. Don't shrug it off. Because they remember. Even now. Even when we'd rather forget. This was Thornhill. This was Ashwick. And this is what happens when silence is mistaken for peace. Not all ghosts rattle chains. Some sit quietly, watching, waiting, holding the names no one else would. Delilah, Ruth, Ansel, T.44, Lila, Benny, Thomasina. You remember now, which means they win, which means Thornhill loses, finally. That journal, Eleanor's, it rests now in a temperature-controlled vault at the Kentucky State Archive. No display case, no school tours, no plaque reading Heroine of the Forgotten. You have to file a request to even look at it. You'll be escorted. You'll be told you can't take photos. You'll be watched as if the act of remembering might somehow be contagious. But make no mistake, it's real. She was real. Thornhill itself? Gone. Storm took it out in 2003, wind like knives, rain that hit sideways. And maybe that was nature's mercy, or maybe it was just long-delayed irony. Either way, what was left, beams, bricks, beds with buckled iron frames, got buried under half a hill of landslide muck and a mountain of legal indifference. Case closed. Nothing to see here. But here's the thing about places like Thornhill. Structures crumble. Stories don't. Especially the ones told in whispers. The ones scratched under bed frames. Stitched into cloth. Murmured in lullabies you didn't know you knew until the words were already on your tongue. I remember the first time I heard that lullaby. It was from my neighbor growing up, Ms. Dorsey. She was 87, blind in one eye, sharp as broken glass in the other. She used to sit on her porch, rocking slow, humming something that didn't rhyme and didn't soothe. One day I asked her what song that was. She said, "I don't know. My sister used to sing it." Years later, digging through archived asylum notes, I found it, carved into the wall of Chamber B, right next to a rusted drain and a child-sized restraint loop. Be still, or the angel will cry. Don't speak, or the silence will die." I called the archives that night and cried in my car for half an hour. Because sometimes the horror isn't discovering what was done. It's realizing it followed people home. One incident in particular still claws at me. A girl. File listed her only as Lila, C22. Was confined to the reflection wing for irreverent conduct. Translation: she laughed when asked to repeat the Lord's Prayer. They put her in correction cell 1B, the room with no ventilation, where the walls still bleed phenol fumes, where 17 pairs of children's shoes were found, laced and waiting. They gave Lila 3 doses of Mercy's draft. She sang the first night, didn't speak the second. On the third, subject vocal cords show signs of rupture. Detainment successful. Further monitoring unnecessary. That's all the record says. That's all it ever says. And so we end here. The place is gone. The paperwork buried. The perpetrators dead or renamed. But the names? They didn't vanish. Say them with me just once out loud, even if it feels strange. Delilah, Eleanor, Ruth, Ansel, Marion, Lila. These aren't just names. They're warning bells. Every one of them survived long enough to leave a mark. In ink, in thread, in teeth inside a locket. They're what you carry now. And you have a choice. You can shut this tab, swipe up, laugh it off with a "that was messed up," and move on. Or, you can tell someone. You can repeat a name. Mention it next time someone jokes about old asylums being fun for ghost tours. Next time someone romanticizes the past like it was all sweet tea and Sunday hats. Because this happened. Not in the Dark Ages. Not in some distant country. Here. In Kentucky. In the walls of a place they renamed 3 times just to hide the smell of what was done there. Alexis Brandt once wrote in the margin of her field journal, "Memory is a ghost with teeth. It bites when ignored. So bite back. Remember for the ones who were turned into silence." This was Thornhill. You've heard the names now. And that means they're not lost. Not anymore.